Welcome, dear listener. You've done enough for today. You've carried the weight of hours and thoughts, and you are safe now. Nothing is asked of you here. Nothing but rest and the quiet comfort of story. Tonight, I'm going to tell you one of the greatest love stories ever whispered through the centuries. The story of Justinian, the peasant son who rose to rule an empire, and Theodora, the woman who defied every expectation to stand beside him, not as a consort, but as the first crowned empress of Byzantium, his partner, and his greatest ally. Before you settle in, make sure you like and subscribe to my channel, and tell me where in the world you're listening from. The world feels a little smaller when we're all connected by love. Let us begin. It is the spring of 522 AD, Constantinople, where East and West meet, and every stone hums with the weight of history. The Golden City awakens on the edge of the known world, cradled on the Strait of Bosphorus, where two mighty continents meet. The sea carries the wealth of nations to her gates. Constantinople, the beating heart of an empire that calls itself Nova Roma, or the New Rome, the crossroads of kingdoms, the seat of emperors, the envy of the world. The water glitters around it, stretching wide and deep toward the endless blue of the Aegean. Ships arrive with the dawn from Alexandria and Antioch, from Carthage and Rome. They bring cargoes heavy with olive oil, glass, spices, and silk. Dockworkers shout and ropes strain as the great harbor stirs, filling the air with the tang of salt and the warmth of the eastern sun. The streets of the city are alive with motion. Perfume sellers scatter saffron, lavender, and crushed myrrh into woven baskets, their fragrant clouds dancing in the air. Bakers pull honeyed bread from clay ovens. Goldsmiths polish chains and pendants until they shine like captured starlight. The great churches rise with their domes of silver and gold. Mosaics shimmer on the walls, thousands of tiny glass pieces capturing the light like the surface of the sea. Columns of green porphyry and pale marble tower over the squares, their roots drawn from the furthest provinces, their weight a silent boast of Rome's reach and power. Here, emperors walk beneath canopies of silk. Senators pass in long robes trimmed with purple. Priests chant in the shadowed basilicas. And yet, not far from all this splendor, down a quieter street off the bustling market, a woman sits in the doorway of a humble workshop. Her name is Theodora. She is spinning wool. Her fingers move with effortless grace, twisting coarse fibers into soft, steady threads. The morning light catches the curve of her cheek, the dark shine of her hair. There is nothing royal in her dress, nothing to set her apart from any other working woman in the city. And yet, there is something, a fire in her eyes, a quiet confidence in her smile. He sees her there. Justinian, the emperor's nephew, the man who had once done this very work himself in his uncle's village, far to the west. The memory tugs at him, a thread pulled tight across the years. Legend says this was the moment when his eyes found hers and the course of an empire shifted. She would be called many things: actress, harlot, schemer, queen. But to him, she would be something far greater. His gift, his equal, his empress. And soon, all of Constantinople would know her name. Long before they wore silk or claimed thrones, theirs were lives forged in struggle. Theodora was born to the dust and noise of the city's underbelly, the daughter of a man who kept bears for the roaring crowds of the hippodrome. It was a rough world, filled with laughter that rang too sharp, and work that demanded more than any child should bear. When her father died, her mother, desperate to keep the family afloat, married again. Theodora, still a child herself, took to the streets with her sisters to perform. They danced, they entertained, and in time, the crowds demanded more than just innocent spectacle. she became an actress, first in small corners of the city, and later in the great theaters, where the crowds cheered not just for the spectacle, but for her. She learned to hold the gaze of 1,000 strangers, to make them laugh, to make them weep, to make them forget the cold world outside the stage's edge. By the time she was barely more than a girl, she had learned the cruel price of survival. She had seen how quickly men could take what they wanted and leave nothing in return. She had borne a child of her own by the time she was 14, a daughter, who would soon vanish from the records of history, as so many women's children did. Yet Theodora's spirit refused to break. She was clever, she was beautiful, and she knew how to survive in a world that devoured the weak. But even so, deep within her, a hunger stirred not for wealth, not for applause, but for something more, something lasting. She left the stage. She left the men who had used her. She wandered to the deserts of Syria, where strange holy men spoke of repentance and grace. Among them, Theodora found shelter not from hunger or hardship, but from the life she had known. She returned to Constantinople spiritually changed. No longer a performer, no longer a child. A woman searching for a place in a city that had no place for women like her. She took up the humble work of spinning wool, her fingers twisting thread as if weaving her life anew. And yet, there were days when her steps would falter near the old theatres places where her voice had once carried across the rafters, where applause had once risen like thunder. She would pause, only for a moment, feeling the ache of all she had left behind. The stages no longer belonged to her. The city barely noticed her at all, but still she stayed. And far from the city, years earlier, another child was learning the weight of labor. Justinian was born in the dust of the countryside, the son of peasants who worked the earth with hands calloused by years of toil. His uncle, Justin, a soldier risen from nothing, brought the boy to Constantinople. There, in the shadow of the palace, Justinian learned to read, to write, to speak the language of law and power. Yet even as he stood among scholars and soldiers, he felt the invisible walls that held him apart, the low-born nephew of a soldier, a peasant clothed in borrowed robes. He watched the court from the edges, unnoticed and uninvited. He studied their games, their alliances, their betrayals. And in the quiet corners of the palace, he made himself a promise. One day, he would stand among them. One day, they would speak his name with respect or with fear. He never forgot the feel of wool in his hands, or the sharp bite of hunger when the harvest failed. He carried those memories like armor. He was a commoner by birth, destined. So it seemed, for a life no greater than the one he had left behind. Yet the blood in his veins carried the fire of ambition. He rose through the ranks, first as a student, then as a leader, until even the emperor himself trusted him as heir. 2 lives, 2 roads shaped by hardship, both born far from power, both marked by struggle, and yet both destined for more, destined for greatness, destined for each other. Their meeting might have gone unnoticed by the city. A glance, a conversation, a thread stretched quietly between them. But for Justinian, it became the beginning of something unstoppable. He could have had anyone, the daughters of senators, the nieces of generals, women born to silk and ceremony. But he wanted her, the wool spinner, the scandal, the woman with a past. And more than that, he wanted to marry her. But the laws of Rome, even New Rome, forbade such a thing. An actress, especially one with Theodora's reputation, was unworthy of an imperial marriage. She could be desired, she could be used, but she could never be made a wife. And so Justinian did what emperors themselves had not dared to do. He asked for the law to be changed. The request reached Emperor Justin and his wife Euphemia, and perhaps, just perhaps, Euphemia saw a reflection of her own past in Theodora. For she too had once lived a life far beneath the palace walls. Instead of denying Justinian, the emperor signed the decree. The law was rewritten. The scandal spread through the city like wildfire. Whispers curled through markets and courtyards. Theodora the actress, Theodora the harlot, was to be a bride. An imperial bride. But not everyone whispered. Some conspired. Justinian was a man of humble birth, a provincial, a military man elevated by his uncle's favor. His claim to power was already fragile in the eyes of Constantinople's old aristocracy. By choosing Theodora, a woman with no noble blood, no connections to the great house, she deepened the divide between himself and the city's elite. They watched, wary and resentful, wondering what else he might dare to undo. Religious leaders, too, watched with unease. Theodora had lived among the Monophysites, followers of a belief declared heresy by the Orthodox Church. Already, the empire was fracturing along religious lines. To bind himself to a woman who carried the sympathy of heretics was to many a dangerous gamble. Changing the law was more than scandal. It was a threat to the fragile balance of power. A challenge to tradition, a statement that Justinian intended to rule on his own terms. And when the day came, when Justinian asked her what she desired as a wedding gift, Theodora asked not for jewels or silks or titles. She asked for a small house, a house that would belong to her alone, a place of her own, unchallengeable, irrevocable, not because she doubted Justinian's love, but because she knew the cruelty of men and the fickleness of power. She asked for a refuge, should the whispers ever turn him against her. He gave it to her without hesitation. Yet beyond personal triumph, this change in law awakened something deeper in Theodora. If the law could be bent for her, why not for others? Why should women remain chained to lives of humiliation and control when they could be free? And so, hand in hand with Justinian, she set her sights higher. They began the work that would reshape the empire itself, the reformation of Roman law, what the world would one day remember as the Justinian Code, the foundation of civil law as we know it, a legacy not just for themselves, but for every woman who had been silenced, discarded, or broken by the world they had both survived. In August of 527 AD, the empire changed forever. The heavy bronze gates of the great palace swung open, and the people of Constantinople gathered to witness what few could have imagined only years before. Justinian, no longer just the emperor's nephew, but now crowned as Caesar, stood before the empire not alone, but with Theodora by his side. He did not hide her in the shadows. He did not soften her title to please the Senate or the Church. Before God and empire, he named her Augusta, empress in her own right. But he did more than give her a title. He gave her power. By his decree, Theodora would not rule in name only. She would be his co-ruler, his equal in law and in governance. With her own court, her own treasury, and the authority to rule beside him. She was the first woman in the empire's history to hold such power, not as a shadow behind the throne, but as a ruler in her own right, standing equal to the emperor himself. Coins would soon bear both their images. Decrees would carry both their names. Together they would stand at the helm of the empire, not as husband and wife alone, but as partners in power. And when the golden diadem was placed upon her head, it was not as a consort or decoration, it was as a ruler. Theodora was crowned not beside him, but with him. The ceremony echoed through every corner of the city. Theodora, daughter of a bear keeper. Theodora, once shamed, now crowned. The murmurs of disbelief carried from the palace to the taverns, from the churches to the Senate halls. But to those who truly knew Justinian, this was no surprise. He had never seen her as less. From the moment he first took her hand, he had seen not scandal, but strength, not ruin, but renewal. And he knew the road ahead would not be easy. The city simmered with unrest. The aristocracy watched with cold suspicion, their alliances brittle as glass. The factions of the Blues and Greens, political and religious rivals who once existed to fill the hippodrome with sport, were growing restless, their rivalries twisting into something far more dangerous. And in the churches, the bishops whispered of heresy, of corruption, of weakness at the heart of the empire. But standing on the palace steps, crowned and unshaken, Theodora met their stares with something colder than defiance. Determination. For she knew, as did Justinian, that power was never given freely. It had to be taken and held, no matter the cost. The crown they shared was no gilded prize. It was a challenge, a target, a promise to every enemy who watched from the shadows. Theodora and Justinian would rule together, or they would fall together. Their rule had barely begun when Constantinople turned against them. It started, as unrest often does, in the Hippodromeith Great Arena, where chariots raced and factions clashed. The Blues and the Greens, once rivals in sport, had grown into something far more dangerous. Political machines, each with their own loyalties, their own grievances, their own thirst for power. The people rioted first over taxes. Justinian's ambitious reforms had drained the city's wealth. But the anger ran deeper. The old aristocracy resented the peasant-born emperor. The church feared Theodora's Monophysite sympathies. The masses blamed them both for the growing weight of imperial control. On a cold January night in 532, the factions united in rage. Blue and green banners flew side by side for the first time in living memory, their cries filling the streets with a single thundering word, Nika, meaning victory. But it was no victory for Justinian. The city burned. The palace itself trembled. Senators whispered of removing him, placing another in his stead. Theodora's enemies sharpened their daggers with hope. Justinian faltered. His advisors begged him to flee, to save himself while he still could. The empire, they argued, could be rebuilt. Another throne could be claimed. Another day could be won. In the quiet hours before dawn, Theodora stood alone by the palace windows, watching the city burn. She could see the hippodrome from where she stood, the very arena where her father had once led his bears to roar for the crowd. How many times had she walked those streets, a girl in rags, unnoticed by the powerful who now called for her downfall? She knew what it meant to run. She had spent her childhood running. But not tonight. Not now. She turned back to the chamber where the men argued over flight and failure, and with a voice steady as iron she spoke, "If flight is your choice, my lord, go. But know this royalty is a fine burial shroud." The room fell silent. Justinian met her gaze, and in that moment he remembered who she was, the woman who had clawed her way out of the gutter, who had defied every voice that told her she was less, who had taken the crown not as a prize, but as a vow. For a moment, no one spoke. Justinian stood frozen, the weight of empire pressing against his ribs like iron bands. He had dreamed of this throne since he was a boy, his hands stained with wool and dirt. He had clawed his way up every rung of power, but here at the edge of ruin, he felt more like that peasant's son than an emperor. And yet, in Theodora's eyes, he saw no fear, only fire. She had nothing to lose, and still she chose to stand. Could he do any less? He stayed, the weight of his fear lifted by the fire in her resolve, and with him, the empire stood its ground. Not by force alone. In the hours before the final strike, Narses, a trusted palace official, moved quietly through the rebel camps. With promises of gold and favors, he turned the Blues against the Greens, breaking their unity and weakening their cause. The destruction had already spread beyond the palace walls. Fires consumed whole districts. Even the great church of Hagia Sophia, pride of the Christian world, fell to ash and rubble. General Belisarius, Justinian's most trusted commander, led the imperial guard into the hippodrome. The doors were sealed. The rebels, once so sure of their triumph, were cut down where they stood. The blood of thousands soaked the sand where chariots once raced. The city burned for days, but when the smoke cleared, the crown still rested on Justinian's head, and at his side, unbroken, stood Theodora. Together, they had faced the fury of a city. Together, they had survived. The crown had not destroyed them. It had made them unshakable. The fires had taken much, but they had not taken everything. As the ashes cooled and the city lay silent beneath a sky choked with smoke, Justinian and Theodora stood together, looking over the ruins of their empire's heart. The streets that once echoed with life had fallen quiet. The great Hagia Sophia, once a crown of Christendom, was gone. The people were weary, afraid, and broken. And so they began again. Justinian moved swiftly, not only to rebuild what had been lost, but to remake the city into something greater than it had ever been. He did not simply restore Constantinople, he transformed it. From the ashes of the old Hagia Sophia, plans were drawn for something even more magnificent, a cathedral that would stretch toward heaven itself, a vision so daring, many said it could never be done. The greatest architects, Isidore of Miletus and Anthemius of Tralles, were summoned to design it. What they created defied every expectation. In just 5 short years, an almost unthinkable feat for its scale, the new Hagia Sophia rose from the rubble, its massive dome unlike anything the world had seen. Suspended as if by magic, it seemed to float, held aloft by light itself. A modern marvel in its time, a structure so ambitious it seemed more a work of heaven than of human hands. Yet all of this came at a cost. The rebuilding drained the empire's coffers, heavy taxes were levied, and laborers from across the provinces were called to work the emperor's vision. Materials were taken from distant temples and cities marble from Egypt, columns from Ephesusiach stone, a silent testament to the empire's reach, and the weight borne by its people. Theodora stood beside him, not as a silent witness, but as a partner in every decision. She poured her energy into the city's people, especially its women. She expanded laws that protected them from exploitation. She closed brothels and built a refuge called Metanoia Repentantia, place where former prostitutes could find shelter, dignity, and work beyond the streets. Together, they turned their eyes to the law. The empire's tangled web of legal codes, outdated and contradictory, was gathered and rewritten. The result became known as the Corpus Juris Civilis, the Justinian Code, a unified legal foundation that would shape the future of civil law across continents and centuries. But they knew that laws and buildings were not enough. The wounds of the Nika revolt still bled beneath the surface. Trust had to be rebuilt. And so Justinian and Theodora began to walk among the people. They held audiences not just with senators and generals, but with merchants, tradesmen, and the poor. They listened. They governed not from distant towers, but from the streets where the city's heart still beat. And yet, not all hearts were easily won. Some still whispered that the taxes were too heavy, the cost too great. The aristocracy watched with cold eyes. The bishops, wary of Theodora's sympathies, held their silence in public but not in private. Even so, as the city slowly found its footing again, the people could not deny what they saw with their own eyes. An empire rebuilt, a city restored, and 2 rulers who refused to turn away. Slowly, Constantinople began to rise again. The markets reopened, the ships returned, the mosaics glimmered once more in the sun, and as the great dome of the new Hagia Sophia rose above the skyline, the people of Constantinople, whether they dared to admit it or not, knew one thing. The city had survived not in spite of its rulers, but because of them. With the city rebuilt and the fires of rebellion cooled, Justinian's vision turned outward. He had survived the hatred of his own people. He had weathered the plots of senators and the judgment of bishops, but his greatest ambition remained unfinished. He did not dream of ruling New Rome alone. He dreamed of restoring the Roman Empire itself, and to understand that dream, you must first understand what Constantinople had become. For though the city of Rome had fallen to invading tribes nearly a century before Vandals in Africa, Ostrogoths in Italy, Visigoths in Spain, its soul had not died. It had shifted east, across the Bosphorus, reborn in Constantinople. Here in New Rome, the laws, the faith, and the empire had survived. But for Justinian, survival was not enough. He did not see Constantinople as the shadow of Rome. He saw it as its rightful heir, and he would stop at nothing to reclaim the name, the glory, and the world that had once bowed to it. Though Justinian was no soldier, his mind was sharper than any blade. His battlefield was the map of the known world, and his greatest weapon was a general named Belisarius, the man who had already saved the empire once in the bloodied sands of the Hippodrome. Justinian's goal was clear: to reclaim the lost western provinces, North Africa, Italy, and beyond. Lands that had once flown the banner of Rome but had long since fallen to barbarian kings. Belisarius sailed first for Carthage, where the Vandal kingdom had ruled for nearly a century. With fewer men than his enemies believed possible, Belisarius crushed the Vandals in a swift campaign that stunned the Western world. North Africa was Roman again, but Justinian did not stop there. He turned his eyes toward Italy, toward Rome itself, the old heart of the empire. For decades, the Ostrogoths had ruled there. Justinian meant to take it back. The campaign in Italy was long, brutal, and costly. City after city fell. Belisarius, ever the strategist, outmaneuvered armies twice his size. But the victory came at a terrible price. Years of war, cities left in ruin, and a people caught between empire and invader. And yet, in the end, Justinian's banners rose over Rome. The empire, at least for a fleeting moment, was whole again. In Constantinople, Theodora ruled in his absence, her hand steady on the reins of power. She held the court together, shielded the throne from conspiracy, and guided the empire through the long years of war. When Justinian returned, their triumph was undeniable. From the markets to the palaces, people spoke of the emperor who had done the impossible, the man who had brought Rome back to life. Yet victories, when they are fresh, rarely reveal their cost. What shines in the moment often darkens with time. The treasury, once strained by rebellion and rebuilding, had been pushed further still, emptied by the weight of war. Borders stretched thin, defenses left vulnerable, but in the echo of triumph, such burdens felt distant, almost invisible. Hindsight, as it always does, would reveal the cracks. But in those early days, the empire stood proud, and few dared to count what had been spent to raise its banners high again. But in the quiet chambers of the palace, Justinian knew the truth. Empires could be reclaimed, but keeping them, that was another battle entirely. The empire had been made whole again, but it would not stay whole for long. Even as the people celebrated, something unseen crept through the empire, silent, invisible, and merciless. It began in Egypt, in the bustling grain ports of Alexandria. Ships carried more than wheat. To Constantinople, they carried death. From the distant shores of Africa and the Red Sea, the sickness crept aboard in silence, hidden in the holds of grain ships bound for the capital. First a whisper of illness, then bodies in the streets. A sickness that spared no one, rich or poor, soldier or priest, citizen or ruler. It would come to be known as the Plague of Justinian. They say tens of thousands died within the city walls alone. Entire neighborhoods were emptied. Markets fell silent. It is said that half the city's population was lost, a staggering toll that left Constantinople gasping under the weight of its own dead. The great Hagia Sophia stood in eerie stillness, its prayers drowned by the sound of mourning. Justinian himself fell ill. For weeks the city held its breath, unsure if the emperor would live to see another day, and in those long, fevered nights, it was Theodora who ruled alone. But she did more than hold the palace together. She oversaw the distribution of grain and food to those left hungry by the plague. Where others turned away in fear, she opened storehouses and sent aid into the darkest corners of the city. The poor, the sick, the forgotten, she did what she could to ease their suffering. The poor, the sick, the forgotten. She did what she could to ease their suffering, knowing the empire's strength lived not only in its walls, but in its people. Once again, she stood unshaken. She commanded the palace, kept the court from tearing itself apart, and shielded the empire from those who waited for the throne to fall. Justinian recovered, but the empire was weakened. The plague had spread far beyond Constantinople. Crops withered, trade slowed. Armies, already stretched thin by war, were crippled by loss. The victories that had once seemed so certain began to unravel. The western provinces, newly reclaimed, slipped from their grasp as rebellion and invasion crept back in. And yet, through the ruin and loss, Justinian and Theodora stood firm. They had rebuilt before. They had faced worse. And together, they turned once more to what they believed could hold the empire together. Not conquest, but faith. And so Justinian, a ruler who had once dreamed of restoring Rome by the sword, turned to something far older, far deeper. A hymn. One that would carry the hopes of an empire beyond the reach of plague or war. One that would be sung for centuries to come. In the silence that followed the plague, as the empire struggled to steady itself once more, Justinian turned not to armies or architects, but to the church. He had dreamed of a united empire, but unity had proven fragile. The western provinces slipped from his grasp. His enemies whispered still. Even within his own city, the divisions between the Orthodox and the Monophysites ran deep. And yet, through it all, there remained one hope that faith could heal what politics could not. Justinian, a man known for law and conquest, took up a pen instead of a sword. He composed a hymn, a declaration of faith that spoke to both sides of the Christian divide. Carefully worded, it honored the nature of Christ in a way both Orthodox and Monophysite believers could accept. It began with these words, "Only begotten Son and immortal Word of God." He commanded that this hymn be sung in every church, in every city of the empire, and so it was. The words rose like a promise, filling basilicas and monasteries, echoing through the streets of Constantinople and far beyond. It would outlast emperors and empires. It would be sung long after Justinian and Theodora were gone. Even now, it still rises in every Orthodox liturgy, carrying their legacy across centuries. But their days together were drawing to a close. Theodora, who had stood at his side through scandal, revolt, plague, and war, began to wither under an illness no physician could cure. Some say it was cancer, others leave it unnamed. What is known is that she grew weaker with each passing year. Justinian watched as the woman who had once defied an empire faded before his eyes, and when she died, the palace walls seemed colder, the city quieter. He had built monuments, he had written laws, he had reclaimed Rome, but nothing had shaped his life more than her. He would visit her tomb in the Church of the Holy Apostles, lighting candles in the quiet hours, whispering prayers for the woman he called his gift. And in those final years, with his empress gone, he built one last Monumenta Fortress monastery at the foot of Mount Sinai. St. Catherine's, they called it. Its doors still stand, its roof still holds, and high upon a beam, carved in the stone of the 6th century, the names remain, Justinian and Theodora. Emperor and empress, rulers of a world that had tried, again and again, to break them, and failed. Centuries have passed since their reign, but the story of Justinian and Theodora still lingers in the stones of Constantinople, in the golden light of Hagia Sophia, in the whispered prayers sung in every Orthodox church. They were rulers born not of privilege, but of hardship, a wool spinner and a peasant's son, who rose together not by the favor of fortune, but by sheer will. History remembers Justinian as a builder, a lawgiver, a conqueror. It remembers Theodora as a force of defiance, a queen, and a protector of the powerless. But their true legacy was not carved in marble or sealed in law. It was in the partnership they forged, the rarest kind of love, born not in ease, but in struggle. For in every moment when the world told them to let go, they held on. And so, dear listener, when all the marble had crumbled and the banners had fallen, their story endured, waiting here, in the quiet, just for you. A reminder that the strongest empires are not built of stone or gold, but of hearts brave enough to stand together when the world demands they fall apart.